This is the panel for drug prices and innovation. Have some wonderful guests with us. Really excited for this. So we're just going to jump in and get started. I think if there's one mantra that the pharmaceutical industry has used to sort of shape the industry the way that they would like is to say that we need higher prices so that we can fuel more innovation and have those cures of the future. So I just want to start off with this question for Peter. What is and you're steeped in this, you've researched the industry extensively. What does the evidence show on what drives innovation in the drug market?
Yeah, this is working right. So first of all, like many things in conversations today too, we get trapped in terminology without requiring sort of a rigorous definition of it. And so innovation is the classic example, right? And I'm not an etymologist or anything, but I think it's simply the word new underlies that as opposed to important or tackling critical problems. And so if you get to call anything new you do innovation, that certainly muddies the waters regarding any kind of analysis of the question you just asked. The other thing that's pretty clear is that, of course, there needs to be rewards for risky investments that are long-term, but there's a great deal of efficiency no matter what metric you use regarding kind of what happens with new products. Probably the most important of which is that, if you take a market-based approach, and I'm certainly at this meeting without an exit behind me, not going to argue against a market-based approach, but if you take one, you are telling people to go where the money is. And the problem right now, of many actually, is that where the money is not where the public health problems are. So if you just accept that this is all funded by society, directly or indirectly, that we have some sort of societal objectives, we don't articulate them well, but they're probably around improving aggregate health, then the fact that, all the incentives are for rare diseases, narrow indications, the ability to monopolize, and actually where the scientific challenges are actually not as great, has led to this massive concentration into very small populations of, patients where there's enormous price tags rather than, tackling. And I'll give you one example, then I'll stop talking. So I'm a triple boarded physician. Don't be impressed. It just means really good at multiple choice tests. And I had never even heard of spinal muscular atrophy until all of a sudden there was a drug that cost a lot of money for it. There are now 9 drugs in human trials for spinal muscular atrophy. It is a vanishingly rare condition. We got nothing coming down the pike for diabetes or nothing important. So that's the concentration. And if you just sort of look at any kind of chart here, that's exactly, we're kind of going in the wrong way.
Yeah, so it sounds from what you've said that it really is about the incentives. It's how the whole market is set up through the regulatory regime that leads drug companies to develop drugs in certain areas in certain ways where they can maximize their profit, get a good return. And so I think one of the things that really it is flawed about the way that drug companies say, we'll just need these higher prices so that we can have these cures, is that where does that logically end, right? Does that mean we should double the price of every drug, triple, quadruple the price of every drug, or we're just going to get more innovation that way? So I don't want to focus so much on whether higher prices are the thing that lead to innovation, because it seems that the evidence is against that based on what you said. But try to focus on why a significant portion of Congress doesn't seem to be on board with that or seem to understand that. So, Anna, with the drug price debates that have been going on over the last year. You've been heavily involved with that, culminating in the Inflation Reduction Act and the drug pricing provisions there. First, if you could talk about what those provisions are, just kind of give everybody a general sense of what that is, but also how we got to this point in terms of how it worked its way through Congress, who were the major players, and how we are where we are right now.
Sure, thanks. And I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible because we could be here all day talking about the provisions. But I think of it as sort of 4 pillars in terms of what this bill actually accomplishes. And it's, mind you, all in Medicare. So this doesn't necessarily apply to the commercial market. But so the first thing, and this is the thing that politically is most salient, is that it caps out-of-pocket cost for patients in the Part D prescription drug benefit, right? So there's a $2,000 cap that goes into effect in 2 years that essentially is going to make it so that patients don't run through, catastrophic spending and continue to have, unlimited out-of-pocket spending as they go. So that's the sort of consumer benefit to all of this. But you have to make that work. You have to be able to fund the thing that can make that work. And that is sort of a couple of different underlying policies. The first one is Medicare negotiation, which everyone is talking about. And that policy is really around taking older drugs, they're high spending in Medicare, and bringing buyer power back into the equation, right? Because right now, Medicare kind of doesn't get to negotiate, and very often for some of these drugs, neither do the health plans that are currently providing Part D benefits. So that's one component of bringing down those prices. A second one is redesigning the Part D benefit, which is really just to say that it's going to shift the liability for providing higher priced drugs to patients back to manufacturers and to health plans, where it currently sits with the federal government. And then the last component of that is an inflation rebate, which essentially makes it so that companies can't price their way out of the economic consequences of the first two sort of previous pillars. So all of that together sort of is designed to increase savings to the Medicare program and to extend benefits to those who are currently on that program. But it is notable that is something that's really focused on older drugs, right? And so that's something that, we're having this conversation right now about innovation, but we're not necessarily touching that in that particular policy.
So this is it built into the IRA is this provision that the drugs aren't subject to negotiation. If it's a small molecule drug, a tablet or capsule type drug, it doesn't enter into the process until 7 years, with the price going into effect 9 years after the drug has been approved, 13 years for biologics. Michael, how do we convince those in Congress that it seems most of them are on the right side of the political aisle, that we can have innovation, we can have better treatments, but don't have to pay the sky-high prices that we are right now?
So, that's a tricky one. The problem with most of the debate over drug pricing comes in the context of the Medicare program, sometimes the Medicaid program. And there's a lot of evidence that Medicare is just paying wildly excessive prices for drugs. There's a really interesting study I commend to all of you by economist Craig Garthwaite and his colleagues, where they look at Part D drugs, compare them to similar Part B drugs. They find that the launch price per quality adjusted life year is extremely high, above regularly commonly accepted thresholds for quality adjusted life years, and that suggests that and those prices for those drugs increased when Part D came around. So it's no big surprise when you subsidize something, the prices go up. That happened with Part D drugs. We're paying for a lot of very high prices for low value drugs, and kind of pharma likes it that way because they've got these patients who are anesthetized from the cost, largely anesthetized from the prices of these drugs. Now even more so under the IRA, and And Medicare isn't doing much to try to contain the prices. At any time, as you say, you try to suggest, well, maybe these prices are excessive. Maybe Medicare could pay less. Try to even appeal to conservative Republicans' limited government principles by saying this is government spending that ends up in increasing someone's taxes at some point. I mean, we're financing it all through deficits right now, but at some point, someone's going to have to pay the piper. So this is expanding government, and we could reduce the size of government if we reduce how much Medicare is paying for these drugs. Pharma lobbyists say, "Oh, but innovation," and it's a very persuasive talking point because there's something to it. I mean, if you pay less for drugs, then the pharmaceutical companies are going to have less money to invest in research and development, and there will be less innovation. Some of the innovation that we're going to lose is not going to be worth much of anything, but there are cures out there. Sovaldi is a 90-something% cure for hepatitis C. We want more Sovaldis. It has reduced, I think I saw one study that said it has reduced mortality among hepatitis C patients by 50%. This is a wildly successful drug. We want more of those. So there's something to it. But as you say, just because there's a public goods problem here when it comes to innovation, just because people only want to pay for the second pill that costs $1, not the first pill that pays $1 billion, that doesn't mean we should devote 100% of US GDP to drugs and drug innovation. That's the logical outcome of the pharma's reflexive opposition to any sort of pricing restraint. So your question was, how do we though make that case to members of Congress? And you know what? It's really hard. And I applaud those in Congress who have tried to inject some pricing discipline into the Medicare program, but you might be tilting at windmills, because within the Medicare program, you've got millions and tens of millions of people who are spending other people's money, and they just don't care if it's wasteful as long as it's someone else's money. We've got lots of examples of these sorts of excessive prices and the moral hazard that comes along with Medicare program in a book that the Cato Institute recently published. It's outside called Overcharged. And I think the only way to get around this problem is to not totally eliminate, but almost eliminate, vastly reduce the moral hazard that the Medicare program injects into these decisions by changing the way Medicare subsidizes enrollees. And instead of giving them a government-defined package of benefits where it's the government setting the prices and paying for these drugs with other people's money, so they're not very careful about how they set the prices, you subsidize enrollees with cash or something very close to it. Let them choose their health plans. Let them choose the health plan that chooses the pricing strategies that they prefer, and inject or restore some cost consciousness to the market for seniors' health insurance, but also prescription drugs, the prescription drugs that seniors use. And I think that's the only way you're going to get over this moral hazard problem, even though I wish the authors of the IRA all the success in the world at getting those prices down.
Yeah, so you touched on this a little bit as far as what you would do to change the system and to drive more value in the prescription drug market. So let's say, for a hypothetical, that you do have the ear of some members of Congress and they agree with this proposition that, hey, maybe this higher prices equals innovation is a myth. What would you advise them to do? And this is open to all members of the panel.
I wouldn't say the higher prices equals more innovation is a myth. I think it does lead to more innovation, and reducing prices will lead to less innovation. The question is, what's the socially optimal level
What's the balance,
of innovation?
right?
Yeah, where do we strike that balance?
Yeah.
And Medicare pricing policy is not the place to do that. We have patents for that, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. But
yeah. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems with congressional understanding of what innovation is there is a dearth, and this is just a personal observation, but there's a dearth of people who have actually worked in industry doing, work that surrounds the scientific aspects of this and the commercialization aspect of this, and understand the business decisions that get made from the earliest moment of, getting seed from funding for something all the way to bring something to the market. And so they're very susceptible. And I'd say this is both true on the left and on the right, whereas on the left, sometimes they're not particularly sensitive to arguments about, areas where there really may be a need. On the right, often there's sort of wholesale accept this sort of corporatist talking points that you've got, it must be a higher price. There's no other alternative, and that's the only way we're going to continue to see innovation. And in fact, what you really need is evidence and someone with credibility to come in and just sort of say, no, well, this is actually how it works, and it's not fully this way, and it's not fully this other thing that you're getting portrayed, and there is some gray zone in the middle where there is a more of a truth, and that is completely lost in the conversation right now.
Peter, how about you?
Yeah, well, lots of things. So on the congressional side, I mean, one of the challenges, and I think I've watched the hearings of every CMS administrator, nominee for I don't even know how long. Still, I'm fantasizing about being up there myself one day, and but that'll never happen, thank goodness. But every single one gets grilled by some member and says, "Commit yourself to not cutting the Medicare program." At which point, that would be the end of my hearing. But it's like, that's the point, right? Not to shrink government per se, but we should be more efficient in how we spend our dollars. Like the amount we spend per health unit generated should be we should be laser focused at, which means in some areas we'll cut Medicare. And some of the sort of rabble rousing around the IRA was like, oh, it's going to cut Medicare, and it's sort of like, yeah, right. I mean, there's savings on other sides too, right? Through better compliance, there's a bunch of stuff in like the CBO score, but still that is really a tough one if you sort of lose immediately on saving money in Medicare, right? And the other is this innovation thing. Michael's right. It's not a myth. It's nuanced, and boy, you get inside the Beltway, and that word nuance just doesn't get you far, right? But as far as as far as what I'd like to see Congress do, and this is so much harder than I'm going to make it sound. Throughout the distribution system, there are layers of problematic incentives that are not only inflationary but detrimental to patient care. And if you break down what happened in the opioid crisis, which, by the way, like the pandemic, is not over, you can see this array of incentives kind of doing terrible stuff. Like, pharmacies make more with spread pricing and all this other stuff, right? And they sort of all knew what was going on kind of thing. They're all now paying billions of dollars in fines. That's true throughout the drug distribution system. It's just the opiate crisis, it all sort of boiled over. So I'm not saying there's an easy way to undo that, but there's probably half a dozen, top line items where you just be like, okay, get rid of this, get rid of that kind of stuff.
What about there's a couple other issues. You've got drug patents, and you've got all the issues surrounding that with how drug companies use those to elongate the length of exclusivity of their drugs, or they negotiate with generic companies to put off releasing those. You've got the FDA processes. What things should we be looking at there to ensure that drug companies have a certain amount of time to recoup their investment, but also that we protect taxpayer dollars and we protect the consumer? Michael, what would you do there?
Wow. So a lot of things. One of them is we could shorten the FDA approval process dramatically in all sorts of ways that would leave pharmaceutical companies with more time to recoup their costs and their R&D costs, because they'd have more active patent years in which to do it, because the FDA approval process can take 12, 15 years and cost $20 billion. And that adds to the cost that they have to recover. You could eliminate the efficacy standard. You could, if it were up to me, we'd eliminate the safety standard of the FDA, and we would get better drug safety and efficacy certification without the FDA. But there are other things you can do short of that. You could recognize foreign drug approvals and that sort of thing. But with the patent system at this point, as you suggested, has become so subject to gaming by the industry. And I didn't think I was coming here just to plug a book that the Cato Institute published by someone else. It's not even, I didn't even write the book.
It's right up there.
It's right outside on the display table. It's called Overcharged, and it not only deals with the Medicare pricing and the moral hazard issues involved there when it comes to drugs, but it also delves into a lot of the abuses of the patent system. And this might shock you all. And I'm going to be playing Bernie Sanders here on the panel, I'm afraid. But the book endorses an idea that Bernie Sanders has introduced into legislation in Congress. How often does a Cato Institute book do that? Well, this one does. And the idea is that the argument the authors make is the patent system has become so subject to gaming. And it is so easy for the industry to abuse the patent system and keep prices high, probably higher than they should be, that we should experiment, the government should experiment with some other way of rewarding innovation, such as Bernie Sanders has introduced his legislation, rewarding pharmaceutical innovation with prizes rather than patents, where the government writes a check to the innovator to cover the cost of the first pill, which is $1 billion or whatever. And then the price of the second pill for everyone in the marketplace falls to marginal cost, which is $1, maybe $2. And then you might still get gaming of this prize system. It would not be perfect. But you wouldn't get gaming of the prices that consumers pay or that insurance companies pay for drugs the way you do now. The idea is not, as I say, pharmaceutical prizes or prizes for pharmaceutical innovation is an idea that is also subject to some pretty serious gaming. The government's going to mess that up in all sorts of ways. But the patent system has become such a problem that this should be part of the debate. So we need to reform not just Medicare and how it pays for health insurance, prescription drugs, and everything else. We need to take a serious look at the patent system.
Anna, how much of the current problem with drug prices has to do with the fact that all of our spending growth is in biologics and sort of the regulatory environment around biologics and the approval of biosimilars and how long biologics are allowed to be marketed exclusively on the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also one of the criticisms of the IRA that, that creates different provisions for when something goes into negotiation for a small versus a large molecule. And that kind of dates back to this congressional decision early on that basically the periods of exclusivity are going to be different for small molecule drugs and for large molecule drugs. And the standards for getting to approval for a large molecule drug, and I think Peter was probably really well placed to talk about this as well, is just it's a much higher standard essentially at the end of the day. It's a more expensive one. So it really starts to beg the question of like, what exactly, should we be treating these that differently? Because the evidence now seems to suggest that it's actually not that expensive to bring a biologic to the market anymore. That's part of innovation. The cost of creating something new should go down. So, we should be revisiting that, I think. But a second component of that is also to, make sure that we actually calibrate our expectations of what competition on a non-branded level looks like and whether or not we're actually fostering that in this particular space. And Peter,
your name was called out there, so.
Yeah. Oh no. Happy to follow up on. And Michael and I never agree on anything, and I'm about to reinforce it. By the way, he has a book out there. But I think the prize idea. I think like it falls in this category of we should be more creative about the ways of providing rewards in the marketplace. Prizes are a version. We had a sort of insane kind of almost parody idea when Sovaldi came out. When we did the math, we're like, the government should just buy Gilead, and like sell it off for parts, treat everyone with Hep C. We did a whole private equity breakdown analysis, and I think it was in Forbes. But we were sort of serious, not that we ever thought this would happen, but that, we just need to think about these things as like, we get this thing, how do we reward, massive reward to the investors, board would have to vote, proxy, all the rest of it. And it's the same with, Bluebird, right? Like now they have an important treatment. It's trading like below cash, I think. Like government just buy the company. And then, we would have this product for everyone and the investors would get more money than they're getting right now. So similarly, I think, and this gets to the patent issue, you're always, I feel like in this town, we do a lot, too much like trying to go around instead of going through. And what I mean is, if you have a clear policy objective, the beautiful thing about being up on the hill, is you can write a law that achieves the objective directly, right? And so this idea of like, oh, we're going to fight the patent thickens, so we're going to reform the USPTO and the patent term restoration game. Just like, forget it. The goal is time limited monopoly, profit regulate, or go down to COGS or whatever you want, marginal cost, like when it's time. And this is sort of what the IRA is baked in. And they use words like, what's the word? Negotiation. But that's what's going on there. And, I'm sort of like, and I'm sort of with Michael also about like we should think about getting rid of the FDA, because at this point, you can pretty well argue the only thing it is a liability shield, right? If it were actually doing its regulatory work efficiently and with a high degree of precision, that would be a huge boon to the market because it would send clear signals. But right now, you're sort of like, I'm not sure what's going on here in terms of approval and what do I know about a drug. But anyway, so we actually propose that you just profit regulate biologics. They get 12 years, then it's marginal cost plus a handsome profit. You're obligated in perpetuity to make your product or sell all of the know-how to do it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You mentioned the FDA there. One of the things that sort of flew under the radar recently was that the European Medicines Agency came out with a scientific statement regarding the interchangeability of biosimilars, the generic versions for biologics, essentially stating that, look, these biosimilars are interchangeable. They act the same way as biologics do. And so these interchangeability studies, sort of extra step that the drug companies have to take to get their biosimilars approved, is no longer necessary. And whether the member countries there in Europe say, okay, we'll automatically substitute the pharmacy, is still up to them. But for the FDA, they're still requiring those, and they seem to have, as Michael alluded to earlier, these extra steps involved. So I know we've got just a few more minutes left. So are there any questions? We'll take a few questions.
So I'm just interested in the policy provisions of the IRA, and first for Anna, but for the rest of you. Are those provisions in the IRA that you described, are they here to stay? Might there be changes in the next 2 years in this upcoming very closely divided Congress, or in the future?
I sort of doubt that there's going to be substantial changes from Congress, just knowing the dynamics there a little bit. Look, at the end of the day, this was a reconciliation bill. It was really designed to pass the Senate with 50 votes, and there were trade-offs made as a result of that. And I think we can talk about that at length. But at the end of the day, I think there's probably a couple of items that are outstanding that, this is a Medicare bill. Medicare is, 14% of individuals in the United States. And so, you have a very large market of people who are still facing very high drug prices. So that leaves stuff in the commercial market, and it leaves, another gap, which is that we're not exactly paying for value in Medicare still, right? Companies will continue to be able to set their launch prices at will because we're not sort of intervening at the front end of when they really start to increase their spending. And so I think, I suspect that you may see some additional work around insulins potentially, and maybe but I don't know that there is the bipartisan appetite right now to move ahead with much beyond that, as far as I'm aware. But then again, I've been wrong before. Anyone else want to take that one?
It would surprise me greatly if either through administrative rulemaking or through the courts or even through Congress, the pharmaceutical industry didn't begin chipping away, and maybe even some disease groups didn't begin chipping away these provisions immediately. I mean, if you want to know just how hard it is to cut Medicare spending, look at the provisions of the IRA. Look at how hamstrung and all of our colleagues were. I mean, how many times did you, in that process, did you think, I can't believe we're having to agree to this because this is just absurd?
Many times.
Right, many times. And it's because of the moral hazard problem. You've got a lot of people making a lot of money off of this program. They're the ones who care about it the most, and the people who are paying the cost. I mean, how much is this costing you and me? A tiny little bit, so much that it doesn't even make sense for most people to learn about what's happening here. And it may even fall on future generations because we're financing it with deficits. So. so it remains. We don't yet know what happened with the IRA. Changed the underlying equilibrium that produced these excessive Medicare prices, so that the new equilibrium will preserve these provisions and the prices will be lower. Or if this is just sort of an aberration because you had unified Democratic control of Congress and they wanted to spend some money on other things, made some savings this way, and so they did that, and we're going to end up with right back with paying the same sort of prices that Medicare was paying before. We don't know, but I think the safe money is on these provisions will not last in the form they took.
So to Michael's point about chipping away at the IRA and sort of reducing some of the damage that it might otherwise do, during the Obamacare debate and subsequently, some of the provisions that had bipartisan support and went through were elimination of the Class Act, for example. It became a Ponzi scheme for long-term care. Or the 1099 reporting requirement, that it would fallen so harshly on small businesses that they had to report every thing over $600 to any one vendor. I wonder if one of the provisions in this act that could be a similar target would be this 95% excise tax, which I think anybody would agree is really a punitive excise tax on people who don't play by the federal government's rules on the prices that it set. Is that something that you think could be a target of legislation that might perhaps reduce some of the onerousness of the law?
By excise tax, do you mean a provision that says that if your prices increase too much, then as a condition of Medicare, receiving Medicare subsidies, we're going to take back some of those subsidies?
It's in the
It's in the IRA.
Yeah, it's what requires. So let me just sort of voice this over. Basically, in negotiation, the thing that brings manufacturers to the table is that if they don't eventually come to an agreed to price, a negotiated price with Medicare, they face an escalating excise tax. I would counter that and say that I don't know that this is something that would necessarily come up in Congress. I think what's going to come up is legal challenges through the private sector. I would also say that that's actually an oversimplistic articulation of what the 95% excise tax does, because there are other ways for manufacturers to cease participation in the Medicare program. There's actually explicitly now written into these provisions that manufacturers can withdraw from the program and not face the excise tax, but continue to market their products in the commercial market. So they would then essentially just not be covered by insurance, which is also an interesting dynamic, right? By Medicare. But they can continue to get insurance coverage on the commercial side.
Tiny little point. If you can avoid it, it's not a tax. So it's not a tax. It's the withdrawal of a subsidy. It's the reduction of a subsidy.
Well, so that does depend on the particular drug in question. I think some of them will be, some of them won't be, and I think this is what it tells us about policymaking. We designed a program that started off as essentially an entitlement, and it's become an entitlement not only for consumers but also for industry, right? So industry is going to fight this, and at the end of the day, it's very hard to put the toothpaste back into the tube. If we were to design a program from scratch right now that included negotiation and created this sort of new ability to get subsidies through negotiation, I think we would be having a different conversation. That's why that tax is there. I think it's just simply a function of whether or not they want to participate in a federal program and get the subsidy that way.
Thank you. Hi. I talk to Michael about this all the time, but I'm just curious about Peter and Anna's opinion on what distortions you guys think Medicare and Medicaid introduced to the private pricing market. That what would be your prioritize for Medicaid and Medicare distortions that increase prices in the private market? Like, what would you destroy first?
You want to start this one?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think nested in your question is an assumption of cross-subsidization and that moving prices in one market shifts them in another. And I don't think there are some very unusual situations where that can be the case, but generally there's no economic theory that supports that. That the firms are local profit maximizers. So it's not particularly a concern. There's lots of distortions in the system, and I mentioned some of them. Like all the intermediaries, the very strong evidence, some of which came out of a group I used to run, showing that like when you have more expensive physician administered drugs, they get used more because there's a baked in margin that's a percentage, not a flat fee. And those kinds of incentives are really problematic. But I don't think I tend to think about these markets as entirely separate with only the rarest of exceptions. And it's why this question about like the firms exiting the Medicare market, I mean, I'm now at a company that sounds yucky, but it's just a market, right? Like, there's an agreement on a price, and I did decide that capitalism was like the way of way I wanted to go. And now I choosing to walk away from one market, I don't have to walk away from another market. I can still sell in Germany too. So I think, and that's mostly, if you look at pricing behavior in the US, you can think of it as segmented in the same way.
Just going to add a quick note. Medicare Part B, they use, I think, an average price reference.
Average sales price from 2 quarters earlier.
And Medicaid uses the lowest price. And it's not exactly that, but it's very similar to that. So there is a lot of price referencing, right?
There is.
And then Medicare Part D, if a drug is mandatory, there's probably a ceiling, and I assume that ceiling might be referencing prices too. Is that ceiling not a
No,
reference?
there's no ceiling.
Okay.
You might be thinking of 340B, which also indexes off the mark, but the fact that it indexes doesn't mean that they move in opposition.
But your point is that Medicare and Medicaid do have an effect on private sector drug prices. And when it comes to Medicare Part B, at least, and the Medicaid program, where Medicare Part B sets the prices, it will pay at 106% of the average sale price. That means that Medicare is creating an incentive for drug companies to jack up their average sale price in the private market, because then they not only get more money there, they get more money out of the taxpayers as well. And so, and there have been studies showing that the same thing happens in the Medicaid program, that Medicaid increases the prices that private purchasers pay for drugs by 13% or something like that. So, and it's not a cost shifting story. I agree. These are usually distinct markets, unless the government links them with that sort of a ratio, and that the drug companies can manipulate.
But let me ask you a prediction. If Medicare woke up tomorrow and said, okay, we're paying 150% on Part B drugs instead of 106%, then the prediction would be that the price in the commercial market would then fall, right?
No. Why would it?
Right, because they're interlocked, right? So the firm has a target revenue. I mean, that's the whole. I'm sort of putting the lie to this thesis, right? It makes no sense.
Actually, might increase in that case. Yeah. Profit maximizing across all markets.
Oh, but if Medicare prices go down, they'll also. I mean, the whole point is I'm sorry. Go ahead.
They'll get an extra. If they increase the private price, the average sales price, then they will get an extra. What would that be? 44% out of Medicare. They might have a drop off in private sector consumption of the drug. So it depends on the price elasticity of the private sector purchasers of that, and how that compares to the added Medicare revenue. They do their maximization calculation, but there'd be a strong incentive in many cases for them to increase the price at that point, because the rewards of increasing the price are greater. Until they hit that point where the elasticity means the trade-off is 0 or 1 for 1.
Which is what a monopolist does.
We're
talking about marginal revenue, right?
Well, everyone profit maximizes.
Well, yes, but in this particular case, because we're sort of talking about it in this context of there's no competition, right? Where this sort of presumes that there is no competition in this market. So we're talking about this in the context of, sorry?
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Sorry. So we're talking about this in the context of whether or not there is or isn't competition in this market, right? Because if there's someone who's, if there's another drug out there, I think that changes these dynamics a bit. But, monopolists are profit maximizers in the sense that they're going to just go to wherever their marginal revenue is optimized, as you were saying, right? So that's the difference here between them and some competitive market where it drives down to marginal cost. So they're going to shift their pricing on the structure based on what they trade off in the other market. But it's not a cost shift. It's simply a giving up volume shift.
Forgot the point that I was going to make.
And we have time for one quick question.
Why can't I buy like a health insurance plan that's based on quality adjusted life years or something like that? Like why, I look into some of these drugs and like, they're expensive, but maybe they don't even work. And why can I not buy a insurance plan that is communicating that for me?
Oh, great. I gotta take this. So you just want to watch the world burn?
No.
But it's true. I mean, some have said, there's, I think CVS a couple of years ago started to try to introduce this into their formulary making. I think the reality in the United States is that we're not at the place where we can have a conversation about what a quality really means. There are some groups that are starting to have that conversation, but we are, because of the fact also that we're not a single payer system, there is some degree, I think, of fragmentation that makes this very difficult to do. But in theory, it's possible that a plan could market themselves in that way. I just haven't seen it on a comprehensive basis, right?
I've got an answer too, but go.
Yeah.
Maybe the biggest two reasons. One, you're not choosing your health plan. We choose health plans in the United States collectively. The government creates a Medicare, traditional Medicare plan. It allows Medicare Advantage plans only within certain parameters. Same thing with the Medicaid program and Medicaid managed care plans. Employer-sponsored insurance, your employer is choosing your plan for you, and your employer is not tailoring the plan for you. The employer has a lot of different workers with different preferences and has to minimize the complaints that the HR is going to get over the health plan. And your particular preference might, cause some complaining among your older coworkers and your coworkers with spouses who have certain conditions. So the biggest reason is you're not choosing your health plan. The second other big reason is that no one's paying for these health plans with their own money. The employers are paying for it with your money. The politicians are paying for it with taxpayers' money. And who wants to economize? What you want to do is economize. And it's perfectly sensible. And it's what they should have been doing in the IRA. And they didn't because they can't, because it's other people's money. They can't use quality adjusted life years to make value determinations. We thank you for your service. But
When you are paying with other people's money, they do actually do that as well. So it's like only
who does what as well?
They base what they cover on quality adjusted life.
So in other countries?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Where they have budgets. There's a little less moral hazard involved when you have a budget, just enough less that they're able to do this, and probably that the drug companies are price discriminating and giving them the drugs at lower prices makes it easier than it is to do here, because there's not as much rationing involved and the drug companies don't push back as much. In addition to, maybe related to, the fact that we don't have budgets here. But I want to see the sort of market where you're making your own health insurance decisions. You're spending the money yourself. Maybe the government is subsidizing you. I would prefer not, but it'd be a lot better than what we have right now. But in a way that makes you cost conscious, so that if there are enough people out there who want to buy a health plan that says nothing over $100,000 per quality adjusted life year are we going to cover, that the insurance companies will offer that plan. But that just cannot happen in a system like the one the federal government has given us right now with all these interventions to do those two things.
Peter, the final thoughts to take us out.
No, I don't. Well, no, on this same. So Oregon kind of experimented with this with their public program, and ran into a math problem. Although they solved the math problem, and then they ran into a political problem that was consequential. And there have been some private. I actually think it's interesting because I think Michael and Anna gave you two answers, each which would account for 100% of our failure to do this, right? One is we don't have a marketplace for insurance that you can act as an individual or even as a small group. And the other is that it would be pretty hard to do it at scale, right? Like all of us who are with, can do it for this drug or these drugs or something like that, but pretty hard to do. But it's highly appealing idea. And, there's the thing I'd like to see in the marketplace actually is similar to the auto marketplace. I'd like to be able to buy used health insurance. No, that I know, not used up. I'd like to be able to go into the market and buy a 2019 policy. And it would just cover the stuff that had been on the market in 2019. And that, what we would do with pricing, I'm not sure, but I think you could solve that problem. But like, that would actually allow for this kind of thing. It would be sort of blunt, but boy, you would see movement in the market, because I think, that would run you. I don't know. Somebody else is an expert.
Innovation is what you are.
I'm anti. I want to move to the Stone Ages, like leeches, and that's it.
No
Yeah.
Sovaldi for you.
No, right, exactly.
No adcom either.
No, yeah. See,
Well played.
Well, folks, this has been.
Also, one more thing, Robert. No data. We don't have the data to come up with quality-adjusted life year measurements for all the things
Yeah, that's
that an
the-
insurance company would cover.
that's the math problem.
I have thoughts about that too.
We could talk about this for hours, but some great ideas and great comments from our panelists. Thank you so much, guys, for being here.